Hi everybody, welcome to this special session where we're going to be taking questions about getting back to school next week. It's the single most important thing on the agenda of our country in the next few days. Absolutely every pupil needs to be back in school next week and in the course of the succeeding days as schools go back. A very simple reason for that. Yes, of course, this country has been going through a pandemic and young people, pupils, have made a heroic effort to stay at home. They haven't been in school, but now is the time when a school is safe to go back to, and the evidence is overwhelming that it's in the interests of the well-being and the health of children, young people, pupils to be back in school rather than missing out anymore. So it's the healthy, safe thing to do. I know that there will still be some questions that people want to ask, but very happily, luckily, I'm joined by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harries, who's going to try to help me to answer your questions. So thanks everybody very much, and let's go to our first question.
How can you ensure that schools will be COVID secure? Our new staff who are either clinically vulnerable or live with clinically vulnerable people, how do you safeguard these people from COVID-19?
Well, that was Mark from Stoke-on-Trent. Mark, the answer is that schools, teachers over the last few weeks and months have done an incredible job of making our schools COVID secure. I've been around many of them myself, or several of them myself, and seen the steps that they've taken, putting in one-way systems, making sure there's hand gel everywhere that you could imagine, and giving pupils the basic instruction, the most important single thing: wash your hands, try to avoid transmission, observe social distancing within schools.
But I think the other important thing to mention is that there's a lot of evidence accumulating now that transmission in schools is low. It can happen, but it's not frequent, and it's much more likely to be representing what's happening in your community than really being a focus in the school. So if there are cases in the community, you may occasionally see one in school, but we're not seeing the transmissions, and people should not think of this as flu. So at the moment, our community transmission rates are really low in general, and so children going off to school, it's a safer place for them to be. There are hierarchies of control, and it's a very controlled environment.
We all accept that over the course of the next year, there are likely to be some short, localised lockdowns which might disrupt the students' physical attendance at schools. Can you tell me, please, what measures the Department of Education is putting in place now to ensure that attendance disruption doesn't mean schooling and education disruption for our children? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jacqueline, and we're hoping very much that even if there are more local lockdowns, which I'm afraid, or more measures to stop the spread of the disease locally, which I'm afraid there almost certainly will be, because we are expecting more local spikes, schools should be the very last bit of society that we want to close down again.
There are two things that are important. Parents and teachers should not assume that if a child has illness in school or there's a case reported in a teacher, that the whole of that school is affected. The whole purpose of having the safety controls in the school is to ensure that we have, as the Prime Minister said, bubbles or collections of children which are well demarcated socially, so they interact with each other but not with too wide a group, and so we can very safely then ask a very small group to isolate whilst everybody else's education continues.
Hi. If a child falls sick in the classroom and has high temperature, how will this be approached? Will the teacher and the children within the class need to self-isolate for 14 days?
Well, Jenny, why don't you take that one?
Thank you very much. So there's some very clear guidance for all schools about what to actually do if a child becomes unwell in school. And of course, we need to remember that teachers deal with this every single day. Children often have a bit of sickness, and they're very good at handling children and making them feel safe. And there will be a process for contacting their carer or their parent. So that guidance describes how a school should do that safely, and for the child then to go home with parents collecting them, and importantly, to get a test. And if they have symptoms of COVID, then obviously the parents should get onto the internet or ring 119, get their test, and self-isolate until they're sure the child is not sick with COVID. If they are a positive case, then the school will work with the local health protection team, and they will work with the school to identify that bubble or that close group of people who've been interacting with the child, and make sure the ones who need to be watched carefully come out of school if necessary, and other children can continue their education.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I'd like to ask what additional funding will be given to each school, particularly secondary schools, to increase their capacity to deal with the mental well-being of both students and staff, as current safeguarding provision will potentially fall short of the complex needs of many students returning or starting school in September.
Well, thank you very much. That is a huge issue for us, and I really understand that many children, many young people, over the 160 days of the lockdown period since we closed school, well, unquestionably have faced stresses and strains which will have impacted on their mental health. And we're massively increasing funding for mental health provision. I think another £12 billion we're putting in. We're also supporting local charities that help young people to deal with the problems of mental health, and encouraging the training also of teachers and staff to be aware of mental health issues and to deal with them in the schools.
The government has now said they want children to wear face masks, coverings. What about children who are deaf, who rely on lip reading? Having a son who is deaf, this is very close to my heart and many others in society.
Well, Charlotte, thank you very much indeed for that question. It's a very important question because we'll make it very clear, I hope, that we don't want to see face masks in the classroom, either worn by teachers or by pupils. There's no need for it. Indeed, there's a need not to have it, Charlotte, because obviously it's very difficult to teach or to learn with a face mask on, and so that's out. I think all we're saying is that in hotspot areas, so where there are if your school's in a place where the coronavirus is going upwards very sharply, and there's a need for a local measures of some kind, local lockdown of some kind, in that case, we're saying that there may be places in the school, in corridors or wherever, where social distancing isn't possible, where face masks should be worn. Now, clearly, for your own child, it's obviously important that they should be able to lip read and to live a life as normally as possible.
We don't know how old Charlotte's child is. I don't think she mentioned, but as long as they are under 11, they won't be required to wear a face covering at all. And as the Prime Minister said, it's only required in those areas where we can't maintain social distancing, and it's school corridors where kids come out of lessons, they may be shouting and excited, bumping into each other, and in areas where there is a high transmission rate. But I think the issue of face coverings is an important one. It has both a science element and a supportive element, if you like, in the middle of what has been a very worrying period. So the evidence on face coverings is not very strong in either direction, and we are continuing to learn, as Prime Minister said, around how the virus transmits, and it may be we do change advice in the future. That's because we're watching the science. At the moment, the evidence is pretty stable, but it can be very reassuring in those enclosed environments for children and for teachers as well, to know that people are taking precautions, actually to help others if somebody is infected, and that's more likely to happen, obviously, if there are higher transmission rates. But to be absolutely clear, it's been noticeable during the pandemic that many of the actions that we have quite rightly taken to control the pandemic can be quite difficult for people with all sorts of sensory disabilities. So if you have a visual problem and you can't see markings on the ground, we need to be very kind and think carefully about perhaps criticising inadvertently those people who are struggling with some of the divisions, and that is one particularly around face coverings. And I think, just to reassure Charlotte, the face covering was not, if somebody is reliant on lip reading, then it is entirely appropriate, even in those areas where, for example, on public transport, where an adult normally is required to wear a face covering, it is perfectly right for them to remove that face covering if they can do so safely, to enable another person to communicate effectively.
Absolutely right, and it's always worth remembering that, as Jenny says, face coverings can be of value in certain contexts and should be worn in certain contexts. But the best thing is still washing your hands, and that's there are something to keep in social distancing. Some things are really of great value. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you all very much for joining, and I hope you got the message. We think that being back at school next week and in the succeeding days is by far the safest, healthiest and best option for every pupil in the country. Thanks very much for joining.